Welcome back. So this time talking about ergogenic aids or performance enhancing substances. We'll define ergogenic aids on the next slide. But this one kind of builds on chapters 9 and 10. So chapter 9 is, or was, the basics of nutrition, talking about micronutrients, macronutrients, etc. Chapter 10 was more applied, talking about pre-game meals, post-event meals, those kinds of things. And so in chapter 11, ergogenic aids, just kind of generically before we strictly define it on the next slide, are things that enhance performance, right? And so oftentimes when we think about that, we're thinking about things like dietary supplements. Now, it's broader than that, but because dietary supplements comprise such a large, I guess, share of the ergogenic aids, then this chapter kind of builds on the previous two. So speaking of ergogenic aids, you can see the definition there. So an ergogenic aid is any substance, mechanical aid, or training method that improves sport performance. For the purposes of this chapter, the term refers specifically to pharmacologic aids. So as you can see there in the first part of that paragraph, things that like mechanical aids can be considered ergogenic aids. So for example, if we're thinking about something like, you've probably seen endurance athletes wear compression stockings, so particularly runners will wear compression stockings, although we see the same in basketball now. A lot of athletes are wearing some sort of compression gear. The idea behind that is that by adding that external compression to the skin, you're going to put some additional pressure on the veins and then speed up venous return. And by increasing venous return, you're going to, basically what you're doing is increasing blood flow back to the heart, which should increase blood flow out of the heart. One of the other purported effects of those, at least as far as the compression clothing goes, is that they can help kind of push some of the metabolic byproducts of exercise out of the muscle. So rather than letting that hydrogen accumulation stick around in the muscle, maybe that external compression will help push it out of there. And then like with the really tight like compression stockings on the lower legs or those things that just cover your shins, the idea there is also to prevent some of the shaking in the lower leg, especially during distance running, because that obviously is, can be injurious to the muscle, can be injurious to the bone, but the idea there is that you also, again, increase venous return, and hopefully it makes you a more efficient runner. So that kind of compression gear then would fall under the category, if it works, of being an ergogenic aid because it's intended to enhance performance, but in that case, it's providing mechanical aid. Other things in terms of training methods would be things like adding supplemental oxygen, training at altitude because that's going to stimulate red blood cell production, those kinds of things. So those would also fall under the category of ergogenic aids. This chapter itself is fairly limited in scope though, so it's only talking about, as you can see there, pharmacologic aids. So things like anabolic steroids, so basically hormone manipulation, that's going to be one broad category. Then there are buffering agents, then there are protein derivatives, and then there are stimulants. They're kind of the broad four categories that we're going to talk about here. So things that can be sold as dietary supplements. So, and you can see that's pretty broad, a product intended to supplement the diet other than tobacco. So dietary supplements include a wide variety of things from herbs, vitamins, minerals, proteins, additional carbohydrates, additional specific fats, those kinds of things. So any of those can be sold as a supplement. It's intended for ingestion as opposed to, you know, rubbing on your skin or injecting or some other method, right? And then can't be advertised for use as a conventional food or the sole item within a meal or diet. So that's why a lot of those supplements will be like, I was kind of thinking of the bars here as I'm thinking through that. So things like Metrix bars or Cliff bars or those kinds of things, those are typically referred to as supplements, although some of them label themselves as meal replacements. So they're not claiming to be a meal exclusively. But anyway, we won't concern ourselves too much with those. All right, so as hinted on the last slide, so things that can be sold as dietary supplements may include things that contain vitamins, so, you know, A, D, E, and K, the B vitamins, C, etc. So things like airborne that are supposed to enhance your immune system, that would fall under the category of a vitamin supplement. Mineral supplements, so things like iron, calcium, zinc, magnesium, those are fairly common mineral supplements. As far as herbs or botanicals, so things like ginkgo biloba would be one, St. John's wort, and there's a number of other ones, but those are some of the more common ones. Amino acids. So amino acids, remember, are the building blocks for proteins. So you can see supplements that are just essential amino acid supplements, branched chain amino acid supplements, full protein supplements, those kinds of things. So all those would fall into that category. Dietary substance for use by humans to supplement their diet by increasing total dietary intake, aka weight gainers. So you'll see those as well, and typically those are some combination of high protein, high carbohydrate things, and then concentrates, metabolites, constituents, or extracts. So concentrates, trying to think of what would fall into that category. We'll go with metabolites because that one's pretty easy. So some metabolites that are common supplements include things like creatine monohydrate is a metabolite, or could fall into that category. Pyruvate was popular as a supplement for a while. Pyruvate is the end product of glycolysis, so that's why that would be a metabolite. Constituent, I don't really know what they mean by that. Extract, you'll see things like green tea extract. And most supplements will have some combination of several. So I said Airborne, the purported immune system enhancer, as a supplement that contains vitamins because it's pretty high in vitamin C, but I think it also has some herbs in it as well. So usually you're going to get some combination of them. And again, or similarly, vitamin supplements typically also contain minerals. So it's not usually just, vitamins A, D, E, and K and some B vitamins. Typically you throw in some calcium a little bit and some iron as well. All right. So again, the broad categories, this is the first of them. So manipulating the endocrine system. So hormone, I won't say supplements, but hormones that are administered in order to enhance performance. So anabolic steroids, one of the things to know about anabolic steroids, so they are, well, let's look at the term. So anabolic means tissue growth. Steroid is a hormone derived from cholesterol. That's what the name means. So they're hormones derived from cholesterol that stimulate tissue growth. Anabolic steroids are hormones that have been synthesized to do what testosterone does, but without all of the masculinizing effects. So as a small historical aside, there were some physicians in the late 1800s that were particularly fascinated with the power of testosterone, although they hadn't isolated testosterone, but they knew that there was something in the testicles of a bull that made a bull, made it act out how it was, but also that there must be something in there that made them fairly muscular, fairly lean, and fairly strong, right? Because if you have a steer who doesn't have testicles anymore, they're not as lean, they're not as strong, they're not as aggressive, all those sort of things. So they, obviously by the late 1800s and probably before, had pieced together that there was something in the testicles that was endowing all of those properties. That was, again, allowing for increased muscle, or increased lean mass, and then decreased fat mass, and then aggression, etc. And so some physicians, particularly one French physician in the late 1800s, used a ground-up extract of testicles from different animals. I believe he started with guinea pigs, but I believe at some point dogs and bulls were in there as well. But at any rate, several physicians would use ground-up testicles and then kind of juice them, basically, and then they would use the juice and they would inject that underneath their skin. So that was their very first attempt at administering testosterone. But again, they didn't know what it was. They just knew there was something in the testicles, right? So they basically extracted testicular juices from various animal sources and injected that under their skin. And so this one French physician in 1889 at a medical society meeting talks about how he's been injecting this testicular extract underneath his skin and how much better it's made him feel, and he's more youthful and vigorous and stronger and all these other things, right? And so testosterone itself doesn't actually get isolated until the mid-1930s. I think it's 1935. But one of the things, if you administer testosterone just like as a hormone, it does all of the anabolic stuff that we associate with testosterone, so increases aggression, muscle mass, etc. But it also has the normal effects of testosterone, which is to increase hair growth, not on the head, but everywhere else. So increases hair growth everywhere else, can stimulate male pattern baldness, and then deepens the voice, those kinds of things. All the things that we associate with masculinity, at least as far as what happens at puberty, right? And so scientists pretty early on were trying to figure out, like, well, how do we get the good parts of testosterone, muscle mass, decreased fat mass, without getting the extra body hair and all those other things we don't want? And so different chemists began trying to synthesize a version of testosterone that was just androgenic, just anabolic tissue growth, not androgenic. So not having all those masculinizing effects. And so that was the idea behind the development of anabolic steroids, was to develop something synthetically in a lab that just did the good stuff, didn't do the bad stuff. And so the first one released in the US is Dianabol in 1958. And so anabolic steroids do, and here we're speaking of synthetic substances, so not actual testosterone, but things manufactured in a lab to, again, maximize the good, minimize the bad. So anabolic steroids they are effective at increasing lean mass, and they do minimize the androgenic effects, so the masculinizing effects, but you still get some, right? It's not perfect. There's still some of the masculinizing effects, but it's not as pronounced as it would be with just testosterone. So other stuff there. So you can see increased testosterone stimulates protein synthesis, particularly in the muscles. So you'll add more actin, more myosin. A larger muscle is a stronger muscle. So then you get increased muscular strength, increased muscular size, and then increased overall body mass. But again, most of that is an increase in lean mass, so mostly skeletal muscle. In terms of the ways that people take anabolic steroids, so one of the things about anabolic steroids, one of the things mentioned in this book that surprised me in going back and reading through the chapter was that they said that the adverse effects are largely overstated, which was surprising to hear, right? Or surprising to read, I guess, in that case. Because, for so long there's been this real attack on anabolic steroids. And not that I'm saying that they're good, but just it's so rare to hear, maybe they're not as bad as we've been told this whole time. And so that's kind of what this textbook says. One of the things about anabolic steroids is that their effects increase with larger doses. So, you've probably heard like radio ads for various men's clinics where they say, do you have low testosterone? You come in here, and they'll administer what's referred to as a replacement dose of testosterone. And so you're getting anabolic steroids, but in a low dose. And so with that low dose, you do see an increase in lean mass, reduced fat mass, etc. But the response that you get is dependent upon the dose. So if you get 2 times the replacement dose or 4 times the replacement dose, you get a bigger response by the body. So you get a bigger increase in lean mass, a bigger reduction or more pronounced reduction in fat mass, those kinds of things. So what athletes do then when they take them is they often take very large doses of them. And not only do they take very large doses of one, but the effects of different anabolic steroids are slightly different. So you can see a bunch of different trade names of them on there. So for example, you've got stanozolol on there under the injectables, Winstrol, Deca, etc. So their effects are a little bit different. And so oftentimes athletes, when they take them, will do what's called stacking. And so you're taking then multiple different types of anabolic steroids at one time. So you're stacking them on top of each other. And again, for each of them, you're using multiple times the replacement dose. So you're getting these huge dosages. But with those huge dosages, that's where you get the huge response. So really pronounced increase in lean mass, for example. But with a big positive, in the case of anabolic steroids, also comes a big negative. So the larger the dose that you take, the faster you're going to see changes in blood lipids. So you're probably going to see a faster increase in atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the arteries, so that plaque accumulation in the arteries. So the negative effects that we associate with anabolic steroids are more pronounced at those higher dosages as well. So that's one word of caution I would add, and that came from an NSCA position statement. So in terms of the effects of anabolic steroids, there's my little, so this is increase in fat-free mass, aka muscle mass. So increase in fat-free mass, I guess it's not exclusively muscle mass, but whatever, it's fine. So increase in fat-free mass here, so on Deca, which is an injectable steroid, and then a placebo, and then you can see after six weeks after stopping use, they still have more fat-free mass than the placebo group. One of the things before I forget, so you can see the two broad categories here. There's orally active and then there's injectables. So you used to see that steroids, one of their adverse effects was that they would cause liver cancer, which is true. But one of the things about that is you're much more likely to have liver cancer if you take oral steroids. So when athletes take injectable steroids, you do have all of the potential negatives there of maybe you get an infection. If they came from the black market, you don't know what you're actually injecting yourself with. You know, those are obviously some potentially really bad things. But assuming you have a good source and you're clean, then like in terms of, you know, clean site before the injection and after the injection and all that stuff, like when you go to the doctor, then the injectable ones are probably a little bit safer because they don't have to go through the liver in the same way that the oral ones do. So there's that. What else? All right, other stuff. So we got things that anabolic steroids do. So we know they increase muscle mass. Because they increase muscle mass, they increase strength. If you've got more actin, more myosin, like I said, larger muscle is a stronger muscle. They increase athletic performance. One of the things that they appear to do is to reduce reaction time. So that's helpful. So if you're involved in a sport that requires quick reaction time, which is most of them, you know, most of your ball sports, things like, you know, soccer, basketball, baseball, etc., there's some level of fast reaction time involved in them, and so if you can speed that up by a few milliseconds, that could be a potential advantage. The other thing also related to both athletic performance and muscle mass and strength is that anabolic steroids reduce recovery time. So we've talked previously about satellite cells in muscles being stem cells that play a really important role in muscle repair. One of the things that anabolic steroids do is they cause the satellite cells to make more copies of themselves. And the more copies of the satellite cells you have in the muscle, the faster it can repair itself, so you can train harder and recover faster. And so then you can get a higher total training volume than your non-steroid using competitor will have. And so then that'll give you a leg up as far as your training goes. So that's another one of their benefits to performance. Hopefully this doesn't sound like I'm pitching them, but they do work. So that's kind of one of the interesting things about the history of steroids was that in the early 80s, there were some studies that came out that showed that anabolic steroids didn't work. But the problem was the doses they were using were too low. And so like the American Medical Association, I think even the ACSM, in the early 80s were of the position that anabolic steroids didn't work when athletes who were taking them at huge dosages knew really well that they did. And so it sort of undermined the credibility of a lot of physicians and a lot of medical organizations in the eyes of a lot of athletes at that time. So anabolic steroids do work. But there are obviously some trade-offs there, just like there are with any other drug. Psychological effects. Anabolic steroids, as you're familiar, do things like increase aggression. They can also boost mood, particularly if you have low testosterone beforehand. They're pretty good at that. They're also can be associated with increased arousal and irritability. When I was it was after college. I was working out with a group of powerlifters who lifted in one of the federations that didn't drug test, and so they all used anabolic steroids, and they made no secrets about it. And so it was really interesting because I honestly never used them, and prior to that had never really been around lifters who openly used them. And so it was really interesting talking to those guys. And one of the things that I remembered was that they always talked about how when they were cycling on them, they didn't need nearly as much sleep. Like one guy was like, man, I can sleep like 5 hours a night and I am golden, just because he talked about how much more energetic he felt when he was taking them. So I always thought that was an interesting psychological effect to them. In terms of adverse effects, so we've talked about those. So increased risk of heart disease is probably the biggest one. But there are some other potential adverse effects to them in terms of potentially increasing the risks of certain cancers, those kinds of things. But probably the biggest adverse effect is for the cardiovascular system, increased risk of different cardiovascular diseases ranging from heart attacks to strokes. In terms of prohormones, so prohormones are things that are hormone precursors. So the most famous, and this is a really dated reference, but it is the most famous of them. So andro, or androstenedione, there's also an androstenediol. During the 1998 home run chase between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, during a post-game interview with Mark McGwire, it was noted that there was a bottle of androstenedione in addition to creatine in Mark McGwire's locker, and so that starts this whole kind of an uproar about these prohormones, these hormone precursors. And so one of the things about that is that those prohormones have to go, you ingest them orally, they have to go through the liver, and then the body can either convert them, for many of them, including andro, either into testosterone or estrogen. So it can kind of go either way. As far as I'm aware, they don't really work. And they're also banned by most sporting organizations. So obviously anabolic steroids are not allowed by most sporting organizations, but prohormones aren't either. But like I said, the thing about prohormones is, as far as I'm aware, they don't actually work. And there seems to be some risk associated with them as far as potentially feminizing effects, some of the masculinizing effects, depending on how your body converts it. Yeah, so anyway, prohormones, not allowed, and as far as I'm aware, not effective, so not something I'd mess with. There are some of the banned prohormones. Like I said, androstenedione and androstenediol were really big in the late 90s and early 2000s. HCG is the pregnancy hormone, and so I haven't seen it in a while, but it used to be advertised on weightlifting, or not weightlifting, sorry, weight loss companies. And so that would be like part of the program would be you'd come in there and they would inject you with HCG, and then they'd put you on this diet, and then you'd lose weight. And the claim was that by combining a low-calorie diet with HCG, that it would increase your fat losses more than just a reduced calorie diet alone. For women, that does not appear to be the case. It might work for men. When injected into men, as you can see there, it stimulates testosterone production by the testicles. And so that increased testosterone production may then have a similar effect to using anabolic steroids, although again, not as high of an effect, because when people actually use anabolic steroids, they take these huge dosages of them, right? And so by just stimulating some extra production of testosterone by the testes, yeah, you get more testosterone, but it's not going to be nearly as pronounced of an effect as taking anabolic steroids. Typically, the reality is that when HCG is used, it's usually in anabolic steroid users who are cycling off of them, because one of the trade-offs of anabolic steroid use is that, again, they're a synthetic version of testosterone. So if you're getting all of this, it's called exogenous, which means outside of the body. If you're getting all of this exogenous testosterone, well, your body doesn't need to produce as much anymore. So one of the side effects of anabolic steroids is testicular shrinkage. Now, it is reversible, but because the testicles don't have to produce as much testosterone on their own, they atrophy a little bit. And so what people do then is, when they're cycling off the anabolic steroids, they'll take HCG to return their normal testosterone production, so to stimulate testicular testosterone production to offset the losses that they experienced as a result of the cycle. So basically to try to get everything back to the way it was before is the reason that HCG is used. In terms of adverse effects, you can see not a ton of research on that. And again, from a performance enhancing standpoint, probably not the most effective. And again, probably used to recover, if you will, from cycling anabolic steroids. Insulin is dangerous, at least as far as if you're not diabetic and you're using insulin as a supplement. That's playing with fire. So insulin is the hormone that, as you know, is secreted in response to an increase in blood glucose levels. The pancreas releases insulin. Insulin causes the uptake of blood glucose. You pull it out of the blood, you move it into the liver, you move it into the muscles, and then you can also move it into the adipocytes, which are the fat cells. So it reduces blood glucose. And under normal circumstances, that happens after a meal. Now, insulin is the most anabolic of the hormones. It is a tissue-building hormone. And so one of the things that it does, or one of the reasons that like a bodybuilder would take it, is that it's going to suppress protein breakdown, as you see. And then if you do that over the course of weeks and months, if you reduce muscle breakdown, well, now you hang on to more of it. And then by reducing your losses, it's easier to add on, right? And so insulin's primarily used to kind of hang on to muscle mass to avoid muscle wasting. But if you take too much of it, it can kill you pretty quickly. Basically, your blood sugar gets too low too fast, and then that'll result in a coma and death. And so, you know, again, the only people I'm aware of that use insulin, or the only people I've read about using insulin, would be pretty elite level bodybuilders. And they're kind of using it because they're already taking so many other things. That it's kind of like, well, everybody else is taking exactly what I am, so if I get this little bit of an edge, if I get a small reduction in muscle losses, then that'll be the little thing that puts me over the top. So as far as I'm aware, the most common population, if you will, that would abuse insulin in this way would be elite level bodybuilders. Now there may be other athletes that I'm not aware of who would use it, but that's kind of what I'm most familiar with. And again, if an athlete is considering this is one in particular that I would advise lots and lots of caution with. Human growth hormone. So we're familiar with human growth hormone from previous discussions, but human growth hormone is released by the pituitary. In kids, it's what causes those growth spurts. So, you know, when a kid shoots up an inch or two over the course of a year, that is from a spike in human growth hormone production. So human growth hormone is primarily responsible for size gains up until the kid reaches puberty. And then after puberty, human growth hormone still plays a role, but the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, play a more pronounced role in increases in size after puberty. So with human growth hormone, so one of the things about it is it increases the growth of lots of tissues. So it increases the growth of, because you know it's meant to make you as a whole larger, right? So not only does it increase muscle mass, but it also increases bone mass, bone density. Supposedly can cause, and I'm not as familiar with this, but kind of one of the I guess common knowledge things, if you will, or anecdotes in bodybuilding, is that it can cause the growth of the intestines as well, or things inside of the abdomen. And so that's one of the beliefs for like when people have a muscle gut where they are incredibly lean. You can see all of their abdominal musculature, but their gut still kind of hangs out. It looks like they have a beer belly. And purportedly that's linked to growth hormone abuse. So in terms of athletes, not a lot of research has been done, but probably a lot of athletes do use growth hormone. There is a blood test for it, so you can test for it, but you know, there were reports that several years ago, I think in 2015, that some really prominent NFL players and some really prominent Major League Baseball players were all getting it from one particular clinic in the Midwest. And so I don't know what happened with that story. But anyway, so growth hormone, even though the book talks about that there's not a lot of evidence in healthy populations or in adults, that is one that, as far as I'm aware, is probably one of the more widely abused ones. In terms of adverse effects, can cause acromegaly, because again, it causes everything to grow. So your skull will increase in size, your facial bones will increase in size. And then it can also have a number of other adverse effects, so muscle and joint pain, high blood pressure, abnormal growth of the organs, like I mentioned, cardiovascular dysfunction, etc. So acromegaly, we talked about that in 202. Acromegaly is gigantism, so we talked about that in the context of like Andre the Giant. If you're familiar, you know, if you're a wrestling fan, the other guy, the Big Show, also had acromegaly. But both of them had a pituitary disorder, but Andre the Giant didn't get it corrected, and the Big Show did, and so he's doing better and living longer than Andre did. EPO, we've talked about also in 202. So EPO is a hormone produced by the kidneys. It causes an increase in production of red blood cells. If you produce more red blood cells, you can transport more oxygen, and so you can extend your endurance performance because you can deliver more oxygen to the working muscles, right? And so that's why athletes take EPO. So typically EPO is taken by endurance athletes. So athletes in the Tour de France, marathoners, those kinds of athletes. But it's also sometimes taken by more sprint type athletes because since it increases oxygen delivery to the muscles, increases recovery between sprints. So they can run really hard for a couple bouts and they can recover a little bit faster. And again, by doing that, by facilitating that faster recovery, it'll allow for a higher total training volume, but also a higher volume of high intensity, high quality reps. And so that's why athletes other than endurance athletes would take it. Beta adrenergic agonists. So the beta adrenergic agonists, that's a fun one to say. So the yeah, I was trying to look for something in my notes here. So think epinephrine, norepinephrine, right? So think sympathetic nervous system activation. So if we get scared, if we activate the fight or flight system, that will stimulate the release of epinephrine, norepinephrine. If we then have an agonist, something that helps with them, something that mimics them, that's a beta adrenergic agonist. And so the most common beta adrenergic agonists are things in rescue inhalers. So from a performance enhancement standpoint, the most commonly abused beta adrenergic agonist is a drug called clenbuterol, which is also inhaled. And so you're probably familiar with, what is the other one called? There's a really common albuterol. So one of the really common things in rescue inhalers is an albuterol inhaler. And so what both clenbuterol and albuterol do is they, when inhaled, they mimic the effects of epinephrine, norepinephrine. So again, epinephrine, norepinephrine, stress hormones released during fight or flight. They have the effect of causing vasoconstriction, of closing blood vessels down, but in the airways, they actually cause bronchodilation, so they open the airways up. So if you're having an asthma attack, they cause the smooth muscle around your bronchi and bronchioles to relax, and that opens your airways back up. So that's what an albuterol inhaler does. It mimics the effect of epinephrine, norepinephrine. Clenbuterol is a very similar drug, also inhaled, but it's not approved for use in the US except for on livestock, in horses apparently. Had to look that one up. But I did know that it wasn't approved for use in the US. But what it does, because it mimics basically fight or flight all the time, one of the things that we do when we're in fight or flight mode is the body is, and this happens during exercise, the body's trying to free up fuels. Because if I have to run away from something, well, I need the fuel to do that. So I need to break down glycogen and I need to break down fat. And so if somebody uses clenbuterol to mimic that fight or flight response, they mobilize and burn lots of fat. And so one of the things that clenbuterol is used for then is to reduce fat mass. So again, it's another bodybuilding type drug. We'll see bodybuilders use it to lean out. Other things that it does, also in the realm of bodybuilding, it's an appetite suppressant. So, particularly as they get closer to a contest, they'll need to be on a pretty strict diet. You're going to be hungry, and so to reduce that hunger drive, clenbuterol appears to be pretty effective at that. But it also then helps them lean out even more than they're already doing through their combination of diet and exercise. But again, not legal in the US, so it'd be really hard to get your hands on if somebody were interested in using that. Beta blockers do the opposite. So if beta agonists mimic epinephrine, norepinephrine, beta blockers block their effect. So if the responses we get to fight or flight are increased heart rate, increased myocardial contractility, so your heart beats harder is what I was going for there, increased pupil dilation, hair staying on end, all that stuff, that's associated with fight or flight. Well, if we block the receptors for epinephrine, norepinephrine, we get the opposite effects. So you decrease heart rate, you cause pupil constriction, you don't cause the hairs to stand on end. The heart doesn't beat as hard, all that kind of stuff. So beta blockers, as you can see there, are used to reduce anxiety. We see those in the sport I'm most familiar with those in are like the shooting sports, where especially things like the biathlon, where they have to be able to do like their cross-country skiing and then they have to stop and then target shoot. You got to be able to depress your heart rate pretty quickly so that that doesn't throw off your aim. So sports like that are ones that use beta blockers sometimes. Now that would hurt your skiing performance some, so there's a trade-off there. But you also see it in like performance artists sometimes use beta blockers. So like people in an orchestra, or yeah, we'll go with that. People in an orchestra might take beta blockers if they've got performance anxiety, those kinds of things, because it's going to slow you down. It's going to keep you. It kind of prevents stage fright in a way, right? But it does slow everything down for you. So that's kind of the trade-off there. Is you don't want to overdo that, because then you're going to be sluggish and not have a good performance the other way. All right, so then on to dietary supplements. So all the things that you can buy at GNC or whatever your supplement store of choice is, or the internet. All right, so first things first, essential amino acids. So there are essential and non-essential amino acids. The non-essentials we can make, the essentials we can't, so we have to get them through our diet. You're familiar with that. So the essential amino acids appear to be the ones that drive protein synthesis. But there's an even smaller subset of the essential amino acids, which are the branched chain amino acids, or BCAAs. You'll see different supplements that have things on their labels about having BCAAs. And so the branched chain amino acids seem to drive muscle protein synthesis. But we can go even more detailed, and the specific branched chain amino acid that appears to be the most responsible for driving muscle protein synthesis is leucine. So if you consume leucine immediately after exercise, or shortly after exercise, that's one of the things that's going to flip you from being catabolic, from breaking muscle down, to being anabolic and start helping you recover from the exercise, but also will help rebuild that muscle. So leucine appears to be responsible for that. There's some evidence that if you consume leucine plus some sort of a sugar before exercise, that actually, if you do it before and after, that is a big driver of muscle growth as well. So it produces a pronounced increase in muscle protein synthesis relative to glucose alone, or relative to just leucine post-exercise. Arginine is another protein derivative, I believe. Doesn't matter, but it's in the protein universe. Hold on, let's see if I have it in the notes. I don't have it in my notes. Anyway, it's a protein derivative of some sort. So arginine is one that we see in a variety of supplements that label themselves vasodilators. So vasodilation is opening up blood vessels. You can see on the label of this particular supplement, it's a nitric oxide booster, or claims to be. So nitric oxide is a compound molecule that is in the endothelium, which is the inner lining of blood vessels. And so in response, like during exercise, you're going to see an increase in blood pressure. And that increase in blood pressure, the heart's contracting harder, so then the blood that it expels is pushing harder against your artery walls, and it stretches your arteries more, right? And so and again, the endothelium is the inner lining of all of your blood vessels, including your arteries. And so when the arteries are stretched by that increase in pressure, the endothelium releases nitric oxide. And that nitric oxide actually migrates deeper into the tissue to the underlying layer of smooth muscle and causes that smooth muscle to relax, and that opens the blood vessel up. So that's what happens with vasodilation. And so arginine is a precursor for nitric oxide. And so the basic logic here is if you take arginine, you'll have more nitric oxide, and if you have more nitric oxide, you'll be able to dilate the blood vessels more effectively, and so you can get more oxygen to the muscles. Now, all of that said, you can see there's a lot of things happening in this chain of events. If you take arginine as a supplement, there's not really any evidence that it actually works out that way. So all of the underlying logic kind of makes sense, but it doesn't appear to play out that way. So arginine is still in a bunch of supplements. There was a time, 15, 20 years ago where it was, well, not 20, more like 15 years ago, where arginine was really big, and it was there were some really comical ads that I used to use in class where it talked about how if you use this supplement, it would help you have big ropey veins. I'm not sure who would be going for that goal, but the idea there is that you can get more blood to the muscle because of the vasodilation, and thereby, because you can get more blood to the muscle, not only can you get more oxygen in there, but you can also get more glucose, more amino acids, et cetera, and so the muscle will recover faster from from strength training. Sorry, and that's typically where these things were seen as supplements. So with this one, though, no real evidence that it works in healthy populations. It might work in people that have heart disease. It might cause some vasodilation in the coronary arteries, but as far as actually enhancing performance in athletes, not much evidence that it's effective. HMB. So HMB is a metabolite of a particular amino acid whose name I didn't write down. Not on my notes. But that's okay. So it's an amino acid metabolite. It's in the book, if you're curious which one. But HMB, the short version of what it does is it helps eliminate muscle atrophy. Well, not eliminate, it helps reduce muscle atrophy. So if given to people who are on bed rest, it appears to reduce losses of muscle mass, so it reduces muscle wasting. And if taken, certainly in recreational athletes, it appears to reduce muscle atrophy post-exercise. And so kind of like the whole insulin thing, very similar type of logic going on here. If you reduce the muscle losses from exercise, so you hang on to the muscle mass you got, you just kind of build upon that. And so it results then in a greater increase in total lean mass. But if you've got a highly trained athlete, it doesn't appear to be that effective. So HMB appears to be most effective in recreational athletes, not in your highly trained, especially years of resistance trained type of athletes. Then we got another category here, which is the muscle buffers. So the muscle buffers, what they do is they increase typically blood pH, but occasionally, let's go, yeah, so the bottom two, sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate, those increase blood pH. Beta-alanine, what it does, that's a fun one. Beta-alanine increases muscle carnosine content. Carnosine in a muscle buffers hydrogen. And so as we've discussed previously, when you break down ATP, one of the things that's given off is free hydrogen. And so as that free hydrogen accumulates, so as the muscle contracts repeatedly, you're going to get this accumulation of hydrogen inside the muscle, which has the effect of reducing the muscle's pH. The muscle becomes more acidic. And as the muscle becomes more acidic, that interferes with actin and myosin interaction, interferes with the glycolytic pathways, and basically then muscle contraction has to stop because the inside of the muscle cell gets too acidic. So what beta-alanine does is it increases the concentration of a particular buffer, carnosine, inside of the muscle cell. And so if you've got more carnosine, you can buffer more of those hydrogens, keep them from reducing the pH in the muscle cell, and so you can probably sustain more intense muscle contractions for a longer period of time. So what that would mean then from a practical sense is that if you're doing sets of 12, if you can buffer that acid in the muscle, maybe you can get 13 or 14 reps out of it, right? So you can get a few more repetitions, you can increase training volume. That's the idea behind beta-alanine. And it probably is fairly effective at that. One of the things about beta-alanine, though, is you have to take it, there's a few things. So you have to take it for a few weeks consecutively to really saturate the muscles with carnosine. Like, it's not like caffeine where I take it and then 30 minutes later I'm good and it helps my performance. It's you have to take it kind of like creatine over the course of several weeks to boost carnosine content to then realize the effects of it. So that's one thing about it. The second thing is when you take beta-alanine, particularly in higher doses, it causes a really profound tingling. It used to be, and probably still is, I haven't looked in a while, but beta-alanine used to be in a lot of like pre-workout supplements. So typically pre-workout supplements had at the very least high doses of caffeine and then relatively high doses of beta-alanine. And so you'd get the effects of caffeine, you know, you're excited, you're talkative, angry, whatever, you know, whatever caffeine does for you, but at the very least you're more alert, you're less fatigued. And then if the supplement also had beta-alanine in it, you would have this like total body tingling. And so if you got this combination of things, now you're probably more ready to go work out. But I don't know, this is probably 7, 8 years ago, I tried a supplement that contained beta-alanine out of curiosity, and like I said, it is a pronounced tingling. It's a really weird sensation. It's kind of like if you have, like whenever you sit on your leg or something and your foot goes to sleep and then you get pins and needles, it's a very similar sensation to that, but it's your whole body. And so like I said, it's an interesting sensation. Now you can reduce that if you take lower doses of it and kind of spread them out throughout the day. You get less of that paresthesia, but in the higher doses, the higher the dose, the more pronounced the paresthesia. So just something to be aware of. Sodium bicarbonate, also known as baking soda. If you consume that within an hour of exercise, I think the actual time window is 30 to 90 minutes. But if you consume that within an hour of exercise, then what it does is increases blood pH. That helps pull the hydrogens out of the muscle cells, and so it, again, buffers those hydrogens so you can sustain high-intensity contractions for a longer period of time. So where sodium bicarbonate would be useful from an athletic performance standpoint, if an athlete took it, let's say an hour before they did something that was going to generate a really substantial amount of hydrogen, a really substantial amount of lactic acid. So something here, I'm thinking of events like the 400, the 800, and the mile, right? So you're going for the mile. It's obviously not a sprint, but you're going as hard as you can for 6, 7 minutes, hopefully less. Hopefully you're faster than that. But that's a pretty uncomfortable race, right? Your lungs are burning, your legs are burning, all that kind of stuff. And so what sodium bicarbonate is going to do is it's going to buffer some of that acid, some of those hydrogens, and so you'll be able to maintain a higher intensity for longer. One of the downsides, pronounced downsides to sodium bicarbonate is it's a fairly large molecule in the intestine and tends to cause pretty significant diarrhea. And so sodium bicarbonate does work. Like, it'll improve your time in any of those events I just mentioned. But the trade-off then is somewhere in there you're probably going to have diarrhea. And so what the recommendation is if you're going to use baking soda to enhance performance, you want to try it out in practice first, because you want to figure out how long of a window you got before you're going to be sick. Because you obviously don't want that, right before the race, during the race, etc. That's the problem with sodium bicarbonate. Sodium citrate, same concept, but doesn't cause gastrointestinal distress. And as far as I'm aware, it's not quite as effective as sodium bicarbonate. L-carnitine, another derivative. So L-carnitine, you have transporters in the mitochondria that move fat from the cytosol, so the sarcoplasm of a muscle. They'll move fat from the sarcoplasm into the mitochondria. Those are your carnosine transporters. And so not carnosine, carnitine, different thing. Carnosine is the buffer. Those are your carnitine transporters. And so the idea here is that if you consume a bunch of supplemental L-carnitine, that you'll then increase the number of carnitine transporters in the mitochondria, and so the muscle cell will then be able to use fat more effectively. That should spare glycogen and enhance your endurance performance, and also make you better able to use fat as fuel and help you lean out more effectively. It doesn't appear to be the case. Doesn't really seem to work for that. Carnitine you still find in a variety of like weight loss supplements. You'll still see it in those things. Again, because of that basic logic. Fat burners, that's what I was looking for. So you'll see fat burner supplements, those usually have L-carnitine in them. Like I said, it doesn't appear to be effective for that, but that's still how it's marketed. But it does appear that it increases androgen and IGF-1 receptors, so there is some evidence that it helps facilitate recovery after exercise because of the upregulation of those androgen and insulin-like growth factor receptors, and so then you can recover a little bit faster. So it may help with that. But it probably doesn't enhance with fat breakdown. Yeah. Creatine, I've talked about in other classes. So think back to the energy pathways. So you've got the phosphate system. So you got ATP phosphocreatine system, then you got glycolytic system, then you got the aerobic system. So if we can saturate the muscle with more creatine phosphate, then we have more molecules that can give up a phosphate and we can remake ATP in one step. And so if we can remake more ATP more quickly, we can increase muscle power. and we can increase the duration of muscle power, of peak power, I guess, is a way of thinking about that. So creatine is very effective at enhancing sprint performance, power performance, those are kind of the same, enhances strength, enhances muscle mass. One of the things that creatine does is it causes, as it moves into the muscle, it pulls water with it, so it increases muscle volume, primarily by increasing water volume inside of the muscle, so it increases lean mass. Decreases recovery time between sets of exercises, allows for higher total training volume, all those kinds of things. So creatine is one of the few supplements that does work. So like I said, it does all those things, and it does them all fairly effectively. There are relatively few known adverse effects, even if consumed for months to years. There are, as far as I'm aware, not really any good studies on adverse effects related to long-term creatine use. There were some articles early on that came out about like, well, maybe it's harmful for the kidneys. That hasn't really been borne out. There was a thought years ago now that they cause muscle cramping. That hasn't been borne out. If anything, actually, creatine probably reduces that. So yeah, creatine is one of the few that works for to enhance strength and power performance. Caffeine, my fave. So caffeine. The evidence is mixed on some of caffeine, right? So it's interesting in the book, it talks about how caffeine enhances endurance performance, but that the evidence was mixed on power performance, like increases in strength and power. But then in the very next section, it talks about energy drinks and pre-workout drinks and how most of those things have relatively high doses of caffeine in them, and those increase power output. So it's like, well, that's probably the caffeine. But anyway, what we know, caffeine increases time to exhaustion. So if you put someone in a bike and say, okay, we're going to have you cycle at 75, 80% of your aerobic capacity, and we're going to have you just go till you can't go anymore. If you take caffeine beforehand or during, you'll go for longer, right? So it increases endurance performance. It may help with fat breakdown. So that's one theorized reason that caffeine enhances endurance performance, is that it frees up fat more easily, so you can use more fat, you can spare your glycogen, and you can go for longer. There's obviously a psychological effect. It improves mood. So one of the things that caffeine does is a mood booster. If you're somebody who consumes caffeine, you usually feel better after a cup of coffee, right? Now there's a limit, but in low doses, it boosts mood. And so with that, because you're in a better mood, you can typically exercise at higher intensities for longer. That's called reduced perception of exertion, or RPE, and that's another thing that caffeine does. You don't feel like you're working as hard because of those psychological effects of it. Interestingly, they really emphasize the adverse effects, which include anxiety, but that's typically high doses for long terms. Gastrointestinal disturbances, same, although caffeine does increase acid production in the stomach, and so it also increases gastrointestinal motility, so it makes you go to the bathroom. It makes you have bowel movements, to continue using scientific language. And then, it can cause restlessness, insomnia, heart arrhythmias, again, high doses, long time. Increased risk for heat illness, that's partially because of the reduced perception of exertion, that somebody could go harder and longer in the heat and not realize it and get their core temperature higher than they otherwise would before they start to feel fatigued. And caffeine definitely causes addiction. If you stop taking it, you're going to feel bad for a few days. You're going to have headaches and nausea potentially and all kinds of stuff. But at the very least, you're going to have headaches, but potentially some other adverse effects if you stop taking it. But from a performance-enhancing standpoint, caffeine does enhance performance, particularly in endurance events and probably in power and strength events. Because pre-workout drinks that typically contain, again, high doses of caffeine do enhance, as you can see there, increase resistance training volume performance. So you can get more sets, more reps, etc. With the pre-workout drinks. And again, a key ingredient, caffeine. Now they do often have other things, taurine, B vitamins, and a number of other things. Some of the pre-workouts, this book doesn't really talk about it, but some of the pre-workouts have some interesting amphetamine-like substances. There was one, it was like dandelion, something or other. for a while there, some of those pre-workouts had amphetamines that had been researched and used in like the 1940s and 1950s, but they weren't as effective and they weren't as safe as some other amphetamines, so they were never marketed. And they kind of got rediscovered when some of the other amphetamines like ephedrine were outlawed. So adverse effects, again, same kind of thing as caffeine because they're stimulants. So as far as the pre-workouts go, from my standpoint, because what we know enhances performance is caffeine, and a lot of those pre-workout drinks, like who knows what's in those things, because, and I didn't mention this in the first slide, and you're probably already aware of this, all of those dietary supplements, those aren't regulated in the same way that drugs that you get, like if you pick up a prescription, or even like Tylenol or ibuprofen are regulated. Those are regulated pretty tightly by the FDA, as opposed to, so they're kind of regulated beforehand by the FDA. You got to make sure they're safe, and what you say is in the label is on the label, and all that kind of stuff before they even show up on store shelves. In the case of dietary supplements, that regulation all happens after the FDA gets complaints about them. So you can market whatever supplements you want. What's on the label isn't necessarily always actually in the bottle. The doses vary pretty significantly, and the FDA has to receive complaints about it before it can pull it off the shelves, which is pretty rare. So a word of caution about dietary supplements is that they can put whatever they want in those bottles and you don't know. So I'm typically pretty antsy about dietary supplements. There are some different testing organizations like LabDoor that go through and test supplements and verify that they have that their labels are accurate, and that there aren't things like heavy metals in the supplements, because sometimes that's a problem with like protein supplements in particular may have different kinds of heavy metals in them that you don't want. So if I'm ever buying a dietary supplement, I always check labdoor.com, not to advertise for them, but that's one of the places I would go for good information before buying any supplements. So just a word of caution about them. And so bringing it back to pre-workout drinks, because you don't really know what's in those things, and what you probably are going for, what you probably want the most is the caffeine. If it were me, and actually I do this personally, if I need a pre-workout thing, I'm going Vivarin. That's my brand of choice, which is why it's on the slide, because I know what's in that, right? As opposed to mystery pre-workout drink, I'm not sure what's in that thing, so I don't usually do those if I'm in need of a pick-me-up before I work out. Ephedrine. So ephedrine, back when I was in college, was everywhere. They used to sell it at our version of like Willie's Market. It would just be on the counter. You could buy some ephedrine. And so ephedrine is a weak amphetamine. It used to be in weight loss supplements because one of the things that it does is reduces appetite. It is also it was traditionally used to deal with colds and congestion because it reduces congestion, reduces sinus pressure. It's a bronchodilator, all those kinds of things. But because it's a weak amphetamine, it does a lot of the same stuff as caffeine. So boosts mood, you can work out harder for longer, you can pay attention for longer, it helps with all that kind of stuff, right? But in the early 2000s, ephedrine was banned because it was in a bunch of weight loss supplements, and you had a bunch of middle-aged women who were obese taking it, and quite a few of them developed heart valve problems. So one of the things that ephedrine does too is it causes increased heart rate and increased blood pressure. And so as a result of quite a few people developing heart valve problems, ephedrine was pulled off the market. So the mini-thins on there, so those used to be at like truck stops and all over the place, right? And so what they are, those are a combination, those were a combination of ephedrine and caffeine. So ephedrine is more effective when taken with caffeine. They have very similar effects. You know why I mentioned that our college store would sell them? You could study for a lot longer. It would have a similar effect to things like Ritalin or Adderall. And so that's why those were there. So that's what ephedrine does. But like I said, ephedrine is banned now in terms of supplements. You can still find it at like Walgreens and CVS, but it is marketed as some kind of an asthma thing. But you can still find it with a lot of the congestion drugs if you wanted to look for it, and then you know, it's like Sudafed, where you got to pull a card and then you can go up to the desk and they'll give it to you. So you can still get it, and it does enhance performance, but again, may cause some cardiovascular issues. So something to be aware of with that. And it's also banned by all of the major sporting organizations that I'm aware of. And of note to that, there were several athletes who died of heat-related illness, so like heat stroke kind of stuff. Several football players in the early 2000s, and ephedrine potentially played a role in their deaths because, again, it does the same kind of thing, reduces perception of exertion. So if you're out there exercising in the heat, you can get your core temperature up to dangerously high levels before you're aware of it. So just something to know there. Citrus aurantium does the same kind of stuff. It's another kind of stimulant like ephedrine. It's more effective when combined with caffeine, but when combined with caffeine, it probably enhances endurance performance. And I think that one is also, yeah, so that one's banned by the NCAA as well, so something to be aware of with that one as well. And that is it for dietary supplements. So next time we move on to more research in Chapter 12, talking about validity and reliability and all that fun stuff. So we'll see you next time.